Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'd like to walk you through my Lightroom classic workflows. Now, I'm a firm believer that photographs are made and not taken. It's not simply about the capture process, it's also about the post-processing of those images. And that's because cameras do not see what we see and cannot record what we feel. Cameras are merely mechanical devices without a soul. Cameras can collect information, sure, but their images do not communicate our memories and feelings without further development. The raw file is equivalent to the composer's score, while developing the image is the performance. Ansel Adams would often take the same negative into his darkroom, but each time he would come out with a different print, depending on what he wanted to express and what he wanted to communicate to his audience. Now, developing images in Lightrooms allows us to express our personal vision and tell our story. Some people will often tag an image when they're sharing it as straight out of camera, but for me that means that they're just prepared not to make any personal response to what it was they were photographing. To give you an example of this, I was in Death Valley in the USA and my camera recorded this image straight out of camera. But this is actually what I wanted to express about this very dramatic place. Now, one of the reasons for the original image looking the way it did was a combination of high levels of UV and atmospheric dust, which sort of compressed the histogram, made it very low contrast, which sort of worked against the drama that I wanted to communicate. Our brains, and my brain in particular, didn't see the scene in this way because the brain makes the necessary adjustments. In the same way that when we move from tungsten-lit interiors to daylight outside, our brain conducts an auto white balance for us. We don't have to adjust the white balance manually to our brain. In scenes with extreme subject contrast, the cameras are least likely to record the truth of what we see and feel about the scene. Lightroom, however, can restore the colour and tonality of what we remembered seeing. So is this image manipulation or is it merely just optimization? People often talk negatively about people photoshopping their images as a way of lying or deceiving their audience. But in some ways it's more about telling the truth, is if what we're trying to do is trying to restore what we remembered seeing and more importantly what we felt about the scene. Sometimes the differences we make in post-processing don't have to be extreme. Sometimes they can be quite subtle in order to express what it was we were feeling and seeing at a particular location. For instance, in these sub-zero temperatures, I've already raised the exposure in post-processing by 1 stop, but I'm still not communicating what it was I was feeling at this location. So with a little bit more effort and moving a few more sliders, I can get to where I am to a point where I am actually communicating both what I saw and also what I felt when I was photographing at this location. I call this expressive editing, a way of communicating what it is that we're seeing and feeling at a location. Now this image is straight out of camera at the top of some sand dunes in Western Australia. Now this is the truth as the camera saw it, but it's not what I remember seeing and certainly not what I felt about photographing at this particular location. So with a slightly different time of day and certainly a little bit more effort by moving some sliders, I can communicate more honestly about what I saw and what I felt about the drama at this particular location. Now, for some other photographers, they may experience different things. So who is to say whether this is correct or whether this is correct? Something with a more a warmer treatment to represent the warm late afternoon sun that was falling at this location. Or maybe somebody else might feel the tranquility of this environment and use some more pastel shades when editing this image. Somebody else might see the drama of the light and shade and want to express this by converting the image to black and white. So there are multiple truths to this same or singular location when editing. Some people also don't intend to say the truth at all. They simply want to create a signature style in post-processing to basically put their mark on an image to say, this is how I like to communicate my photographs to other people. So before we go into some of the editing inside of Lightroom, I want to talk about color accuracy, because as we're moving color, I think it's very important to make sure that we have color in control using the devices at hand. Now, one of the first things I would encourage you to do is invest in a good quality monitor. Now, most monitors are reasonable quality. There are some shockers out there. However, I've been at workshops where some of the screens on a laptop are really quite blue, and there's no way the photographer can edit color in any degree of control, because already the colors they're seeing have been skewed quite cool. Now I'm using this 27-inch 4K monitor with a broad color gamut. I can see much richer range of colors with full detail inside of those saturated colors, and so this is what I choose to use to edit my images. I will edit on location on a laptop screen as well, but I will, when always choosing a laptop, make sure those laptop monitor screens are of a reasonable quality. One of the other steps that I do take is I go the extra mile by also creating a profile for that monitor, which makes sure that the colors I'm seeing are faithful and accurate. Now, one of the things that we can complete that color management workflow with is also to create a custom profile for your camera. I use this color checker passport in order to do that. Some photographers will start comparing color rendition from maybe Canon, Nikon or Sony, but you can actually remove that argument by making your camera capture colors faithfully. And then if you're working with a profiled monitor, those same colors that are being captured faithfully will also be shown faithfully on that monitor screen. And if you're going to that next step where you're actually printing your images, you should also get that extra mile as well and create a custom color profile for your paper ink combination. And then really, if you've been photographing a blue cyan of a particular maybe bird or flower, when you print that out, that color will be faithful to your original subject. If you're wanting to implement a color managed workflow in your own photography workflow, then head over to my website, look for ebooks, and I've got a 50-page ebook on color management. Once you've set a color managed workflow up, it stays set up, so you will have a faithful color managed workflow after you've read and implemented the information in this ebook. Okay, let's get to grips with Lightroom Classic, and we'll first take a look at the subject of white balance. Now, some photographers will start with white balance because it's at the top of the basic panel, and some people, so-called experts, will actually say that's the way you're supposed to edit in Lightroom, a top-down approach. But I've been a beta tester for many decades now, and the software engineers of Lightroom certainly don't intend for you to edit in a linear way, because this is a non-linear, non-destructive editing package. So it doesn't really matter where you start editing and where you finish editing. So what I would encourage you to do is perhaps start editing with what annoys you the most about your image. What do you feel the camera has let you down most? Maybe it's exposure, maybe it is white balance, but start with editing that, and then finish off with editing the little things or the little annoyances, the ones that you've noticed only at the end of the workflow. So in these images, even though I'm talking about white balance first, they've already had some edits, and sometimes I can't actually see to edit the white balance until I've corrected some of the tonality. Now, these images that it will follow are using auto white balance. This is the default for most cameras that are sold now. We don't actually go in and create a custom white balancing camera unless we specifically want to. So most photographers just leave it auto white balance and then make a correction in post-processing. Now, one of the problems with doing a white balance is when we first look at an image, unless it's a way off, we often see that that is appropriate. And it's not until we move the white balance a little or a lot do we see that there is something better to be had. side. So I'm going to make some adjustments here, some befores and afters, so you can see why I've chosen to move the white balance, not just for accuracy but also for creating complementary colors in my workflow. For instance, in this one I've moved the white balance a little bit cooler. And now we're getting some cooler tones in the background behind this soldier wearing these warm toned clothing. Now this creates the complementary colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel, and this creates a visually pleasing result for many people. It's also allowed me to create the fact that actually the blue tones in the background actually communicate the fact that this was a wet and cool morning, and so I'm doing this for expressive purposes as well as for perhaps accuracy and the need to create complementary colors. To give you another example, again, auto white balance. The sun has just set now, so we're just using the twilight glow. It is quite warm lighting from the sky, but if I just lower the color balance a little bit further, the skin tones carry on appearing warm, but lowering it by 700 degrees Kelvin on that top slider in the white balance control, that temperature slider, we're actually creating those complementary colors again. We're actually allowing that sky to go bluer and create that complementary color to the warm skin. To give you another example, this is actually a little bit closer to what I was actually photographing. But if I then move the tint slider, the one below the temperature slider, to +16, I'm actually, well, I moved it to -5 actually, but it's 16 points difference between how the auto white balance saw it and what I'm choosing to communicate. And what I'm doing now is I'm creating these blue purple tones, which are the complementary color to those yellow orange tones inside of this image. So again, I feel this is a better way to showcase the drama in this particular scene. Another example, again with the auto white balance, again it's sunset, so they are warm colors, but again just lowering that temperature slider, this time by over 2,500 degrees Kelvin, I'm getting that nice mix between the cool light of the shadows and also the warm light of both the sunset and also the tungsten artificial lights that are coming on in the buildings in this Melbourne skyline scene here. Okay, so just moving the tint or white temperature slider can create dramatic differences, and so you should never just accept the auto white balancing camera got it correct. You should always explore moving those sliders just in case there is something that you would prefer. This one, for instance, the tones are actually quite neutral, and the camera has recorded them a little bit cold in comparison to what I was seeing. I've gone a little bit over the top here in order to create this sort of fiery scene with these warmer colors to showcase the drama of the incoming storm. And we also have the sun in view as well behind these clouds, so I also wanted to express the warmth of that sun cutting through these storm clouds, giving that sense of energy to this scene. So again, we're using color to create complementary colors, maybe for accuracy, but also for communicating feeling or emotion into a scene. I was with a photographer at the sand dunes just recently, and he started post-processing his sand dune images. Very, very cool. Now, one of the reasons that somebody might want to do this is blue talks about maybe it's the color of the sky, it's the color of the open sea, it's a sense of broad open space, maybe tranquility. And so if we take a look at these sand dunes and we're reminded of big waves in the sea, and we're also trying to communicate that through the color blue, then what's to say that lowering the temperature slider 2,000 degrees Kelvin is wrong? Because again, it's just a way of communicating a mood into a scene. Now, if you've been watching Hollywood movies, I'm sure you have, you'll probably notice that they're not trying to create accurate colors in most of the movies you're watching. They're using color as a way of communicating mood into the scenes. So by all means, play with those white balance, not just for accuracy, but also for expressing mood. Let's move on to the subject of exposure. Now, one of the important things before we start playing with exposure in post-processing is to make sure that we don't lose any detail by inappropriate exposures in camera. One of the ways you can lose some of the detail in highlights is when a scene has dominant dark tones. The camera thinks that these unlit areas need to be brightened up when in fact they are just very dark tones. And if the dominant tones are extensive across the viewfinder, you'll find the automatic exposure will start raising the exposure and may push some of the highlights over the edge, i.e. they will start to become overexposed and start losing information in those highlights. Now, if you're a mirrorless user or using live view on your DSLR, you can actually get a histogram up and start viewing how that exposure is working using what's called a histogram. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about histograms and how you can use them to control exposure both in camera and also post-processing. But one of the things I will do in camera is, if I notice this happening, is I will simply lower the exposure by maybe 1 EV, 1 stop, using the shutter speed, the aperture, or just using the exposure compensation dial, which I'm highlighting here in this slide. And once you're pulling that information back into the histogram on that right side of the histogram, then you know you're not losing detail anymore. Those live histograms will warn you if you've got data banked up on the right side of the histogram, then it is a warning that you might be losing detail in those highlight tones. Now, sometimes we can recover a small amount of loss of tone in the highlights, but in some cases we can't. If we push that exposure too bright, we will end up with having absolute clean detail. There will be no detail to be pushed back into those tones in post-processing. If you're unsure, you can always review or chimp an image after you've captured it and try and find on your camera where you can see the histogram. Sometimes the cameras will often also have something called blinkies. They will warn you of the over or under exposure by blinking those tones, and so maybe you have the opportunity to take a second image with an adjusted exposure. So in this example here, you can see those bright highlight tones are well inside of that right side of the histogram, so I know I have an appropriate exposure in camera. Okay, so the basic goal of that exposure and how we can work with that histogram is consider the histogram, the sides of the histogram, as your goalposts. And what we have to do when collecting the information, the tonality, we're trying to get all of that detail of the darkest shadow tones and the brightest highlight tones in between the goalposts. It doesn't really matter about the shape of the histogram in the middle. It's more important that we get the information away from the extreme edges of that histogram. So the way you deal with this is occasionally you might be creating darker images than you would intend to finally produce. But so long as we're recording the detail in those brightest highlights, which I've drawn an arrow to here, we can always open up the shadows in post-processing, such as this. So basically we're exposing for the highlights and processing for the shadows. And I'll give you several examples as we move through these slides. There is an exception to the rule. The only time we don't actually want detail in the brightest highlights is when those highlights are actually the light source themselves, or a reflection of the light source off a shiny surface such as water or metal. And the reason that we don't want to see good detail in there is everything else would be way too dark. These highlight tones, the light source itself, is often referred to as specular highlights, and these we do allow to clip to overexposure. And in Lightroom we can click on that triangle above the top right hand side of the histogram to get a clipping warning. And if it's just the light source that is clipping, we're okay. We have haven't overexposed those particular tones. And the opposite is true in the shadows, is if we have the absence of a surface, maybe it's a cave entrance, or in this instance an open doorway, so we're not looking at an actual surface where light is falling on, we're looking at the absence of a surface. What I've called here is a void. Now in tonal terms, it is, most photographers agree, Ansel Adams set up something called the zone system, sort of the rules of tonality, if you like. Now rules are meant to be broken, but these are generally the rules that most photographers tend to adhere to, and most photographers would tend to clip these tones that are not the surface but the absence of a surface, the absence of light at all. When we're setting a white and a black point inside of Lightroom, we can do various auto ways. We can click on the auto button, we can hold down the shift key and click on the word whites or the words blacks, and we can set the white point and black point automatically. It'll generally move the brightest tone to the right side and the darkest tone to the left side of the histogram. For many photographers who are shooting JPEG in camera, this is what generally happens with the processing inside the camera, but for RAW shooters we have to do this in post-processing. Now most of the time Lightroom makes a good decision when setting those auto white and black points, but in many instances it doesn't. In this particular image we don't have any bright tones outside of the character, and as you're probably well aware, Caucasian skin, the brightest tone of Caucasian skin isn't absolute white. It's a couple of tones down the zone system in tonality there, and so if we set that too high, the skin will appear to be too bright, and so we have to sort of override maybe any auto adjustment and just pull that white slider. Now it's the white slider that controls the extreme right side of the histogram, so we may need to just pull that a little bit further to the left so we get good detail. So if I do that, we're going to get more natural tone in the skin. So this is one of the rare instances we don't use an auto adjustment to set those whites inside of this image. Another alternative to that processing maybe is just to pull the highlights further down. The highlights are the tones just below the whites, and that's typically where the skin or Caucasian skin is sitting, so we can pull that down just so we get rich detail in those brightest skin tones. So sometimes it's a balance between highlights and white slider. Another important feature in post-processing, and that is the ability to crop. We've already framed the image in camera, but we have a second opportunity to perfect that framing. Okay, so one of the things that I do, and because I'm using prime lenses a lot, I don't have the ability to zoom in or zoom out to get the perfect crop. I will often just fine-tune that crop in post-processing, and one of the things that I'm often cropping for is to remove visual distractions at the edges of the frame. For instance, this image of this ladder with beautiful shadow, I've got some sky on the right side which doesn't help the communication whatsoever. So I'm simply going to crop it out in post-processing. So the cropped image is less confusing. The eye of the viewer isn't going to be pulled over to the right side of the image for seemingly no purpose at all. It doesn't add to the communication. So we just focus now just on the ladder and just on the shadow in this image. Here's another example. I took this image very quickly. I just swung around as I saw some smoke happening out the periphery of my vision, and I took one shot, and we have some distractions at the top of the image which doesn't help the communication in the lower part of the image. You can also see I'm using what's called a crop overlay. You can cycle through your crop overlays by pressing the O key repeatedly inside of the crop overlay function or feature inside of Lightroom. This allows me to have what's called the rule of thirds. It's a compositional technique which avoids us centering information, and the rule basically states that we can try and put important elements on the important intersections and also on the lines. And you can see I've sort of lined up the two characters on the rule of thirds, and also where the pavement hits the wall. We've also got the rule of thirds working quite well there. Now, it isn't something that you always have to do. It's just something that you might want to play with some of your compositions. And here is the final cropped image. Because we can't see that visual clutter at the top of the image, the eye of the viewer is held with the two characters and the smoke and the steps, creating those diagonals. And one of the diagonals, or in fact both the diagonals, act as what's called leading lines, taking the eye towards the two characters inside of the image. This was partly luck on my part with composing landscapes. We have a little bit more time and a little bit more control to organize, but in this case I was slightly lucky that some of these elements just lined up with the rule of thirds. Here's another example. This was captured with a long telephoto lens from a boat, and we have the water at the bottom of the scene. But it's not really a communication about the water. It's simply a communication about this impenetrable sort of bush or forested area, and using a long telephoto lens has really compressed the perspective, and just altering the tonality slightly so I can get the bright white branches of those dead trees showcasing gives me the drama that I actually wanted to communicate in this particular scene. Now, both the camera and also my human side probably wouldn't have seen the drama at the distance because of the amount of ultraviolet light softening the contrast in the situation. So we're basically restoring that to the scene by a lot of these sliders that we've moved. You'll see a negative blacks adjustment and a positive whites adjustment. You'll also see added contrast on the contrast slider, which is basically restoring the drama and contrast to this scene that was sort of eaten away a little bit by the extreme focal length of this lens. Okay, so let's take a look at one more example. Again, we've got a little bit of water at the bottom of the image, which in this instance I've decided again doesn't help the communication, so again I choose to crop out. For many photographers, they will choose to frame slightly wide and then crop a little bit tighter in post. Gives you a little bit more freedom when designing, so we don't have to create the perfect crop in camera each time. And there is the final result in this instance, which is exactly what I want. I just want two elements here, the forest and the rock. I don't need a third element, the water at the bottom of the screen. I don't want the viewer's eye wandering to the edge of the frame. Here's another reason we may want to crop. I may have gone as close as I can go to the minimum focusing distance of the lens, but I want to go even closer, and so in this instance I've just simply cropped. Most of us are using megapixel rich cameras, and we can crop quite aggressively and still have enough pixels for a double page spread in a magazine, a very large print, or enough to fill our ultra high definition TVs or 4K TVs. So in this instance I've just cropped closer. Another reason we may want to just stand back a little bit is because of depth of field. The closer you move to your subject, the shallower the depth of field. So just by moving back and then cropping in post, we'll just extend the depth of field a little bit more. We're going to start using these crop overlays now. So rule of thirds is perhaps the most famous crop rule that most people know, and here it is exercised or applied, overlaid over this cowboy in Texas, and you can see down the center of his face I put those intersections, as this is the most important part of the composition. And you can see his body, his waistline also lines up with the lower horizontal line on that rule of thirds, and also the edge of his shoes line up with the vertical line on the left. So again, I did a little bit of that work in camera, but I've just fine-tuned that in post-processing. If we press the O key a number of times, we'll come to something that looks on the surface to be the rule of thirds, but actually the vertical lines and the horizontal lines are just a little bit closer towards the center. And this is called the golden ratio. And this actually predates the rule of thirds, which is sort of a simplified golden ratio. And for many landscape photographers, and me included, I actually prefer most of the time to put a horizon line on the lower horizontal line of the golden ratio rather than the rule of thirds, which I think is a little bit of extreme for many compositions that I'm creating. Okay, so here's the golden ratio in use with a vertical portrait. So we've got the eyes perfectly lined up with the intersecting points of the verticals and the top horizontal line. And so basically I've just slightly rotated the image because the guy was leaning back in a chair, just to make that perfectly vertical, and then just align that just by expanding and contracting the aspect ratio and just moving that until I get the perfect composition that I wanted. Now, we don't always have to create off-center just because somebody said that rule of thirds or the golden ratio were the best designs. We can also approach a subject with the view to creating a symmetrical image, and in this particular instance I wanted absolute symmetry. The vanishing point, the point where all of those converging lines converge right in the center of the image, is exactly what I wanted, and so I'm not going to use the rule of thirds or golden ratio in this instance, because I want everything to work around the middle point of both the vertical and horizontal in the frame. Another reason to crop is to change the shape of an image. Now, we're often using 3:2 or 4:3 sensors, and these don't tend to have any correlation with the majority of screens that we're using, which tend to have a 16:9 or 16:10 aspect ratio. So we often have to, if we've been shooting in horizontal format, we often have to lose some of the top and the bottom or both in order to create that 16:9 aspect ratio. So in Lightroom we can actually pick up those aspect ratios on the right side of that crop overlay feature. You'll have other options as well that you can pick up. 16:9 is a common one because if we crop images to 16:9 and then view them on a large 30-inch or 27-inch monitor or a big Ultra HD TV, that is absolutely going to fill that screen with no what's called letterboxing top and bottom or on the left and right side. And so as I go into full screen on this image, you'll see in the movie that you're watching that will go full screen in the movie as well. So that's a great way of filling the viewer's attention and using every pixel of the screen. Now, one of the things that we can do when we're cropping is also have the information. Just tap the I key a number of times and you can cycle through the information in Lightroom Classic. And you'll also see in one of the information views, you'll see the pixel dimensions, not the pixel dimensions of the capture, but the pixel dimensions of what you cropped down to. And so it's quite useful to know some of the pixel dimensions of some of the monitors that we're actually using. Now 4K or Ultra HD, as it's often referred to, has a specific set of pixel dimensions, and that is 3,840 pixels wide and 2,160 pixels high. Now this is exactly double the old HD format, which often people referred to as 1080 HD. That was 1080 on the vertical dimension. Now the reason that these pixel dimensions are useful is if you are cropping and you don't want to overcrop for the screen that you want to present on, it's worth having this information highlighted so you know if you crop any further, you're going to be cropping down below the number of pixels that the screen uses. Now if the screen shows that image full screen, generally it'll start softening the image. It will start adding pixels to the equation, but something called interpolation. But this is generally a bad idea if you're wanting absolute quality when showcasing your work on a 4K screen. Now it's also worth noting that a 4K image in megapixels is 8.3 megapixels, so most people who are using say 24 megapixel sensors will quickly realize that we can crop and throw away 2/3 of the pixels and still have enough to fill a 4K screen. In this image you can see the crop overlay is quite extreme. We've got a lot of unused pixels around that crop, but we're still pulling a 3840 pixel width on this, so it's still technically a 4K crop. And the reason for this is it's coming from a 42.4 megapixel image, and that does outline one of the advantages of using these ultra high resolution cameras is their croppability, if that's a word. And there we see, if we go full screen, that we're not going to lose any quality at all because we're not over cropping this particular image. So that's another reason we may be cropping, is we might be just getting rid of surplus pixels because we didn't have a longer telephoto lens with us, and so we're just cropping in post. We do have the option on many cameras to crop in camera as well. Word of warning for those people with 24 megapixel sensors: when you crop to APS-C on a full frame camera, you are coming down to 10 megapixels, and when you're cropping to the 16:9 aspect ratio, you've barely got enough pixels just to straighten a slightly crooked image before we hit that 4K mark. Now obviously we don't always have to restrict ourselves to cropping to 4K and no more, because some people will want to crop even further because their intended output is not a 4K screen. And to give you some of those pixel resolutions, just remember HD is half of the pixel dimensions of 4K. Facebook, the maximum width or longest dimension, on an image going to Facebook is 2048 pixels. If you upload anything with higher resolution, it will just be downsized to 2048. And Instagram is even less. It's 1080 pixels wide. It does highlight slightly why I'm a little bit confused about Instagram's popularity for showcasing photography when we have so few pixels on offer to showcase, especially things like quality of camera, quality of lens. Very hard to see when you're looking at perhaps just a 1 megapixel from a 42 megapixel camera. And so there is the 4K crop again, just to highlight that we can pull maximum detail even though we've been cropping quite aggressively on some images. If you are exporting from Lightroom and you're exporting say a 4K image, as you go to the export dialog, just take a look at these settings. We will be using the JPEG file format because most people don't have high color gamut screens like I have. It's typical to actually drop the color space to sRGB. It's very important to make sure the image being exported does have a color profile if you're not using sRGB. So just to play safe, sRGB. Quality, you can go up to 100, but to be honest, as long as you don't re-edit an exported JPEG, you're not going to see any difference between quality 90, but the image is going to upload a little bit faster because it's going to be significantly smaller, just a quality 90. One of the things that I do is resize to fit, and this is where you put in the long edge and then put in the pixel dimensions that you're looking for, 3840 as I said for 4K. There is a resolution screen next to this, but resolution in pixels per inch or pixels per centimeter is only ever used for printing when the image is going to paper. So it bears no, it doesn't matter at all what you put into that little dialog. It doesn't affect the export whatsoever. So you could put in 1 or 1000, it doesn't change the size of the image being exported. Now you might want to check the little box above that resolution which says don't enlarge. If you have cropped quite aggressively, you may choose not to grow that image through interpolation using Lightroom. So one of the other options there below that is output sharpening. Because we are downsizing quite a lot, especially for social media, you will get a sharper image by adding a little bit of sharpening in at the export level. And so I would check that sharpen for, select screen or print, important for screen especially, and then just choose, you can choose standard as the average there. I do have some export presets that are available on my website in the download section there if you're looking to create some social media export presets there, so you don't have to actually enter these in at all. So let's go back to Lightroom's editing tools, and we'll look at one of the most important pair of sliders that are available to us in the basic panel, and that is shadows and highlights. Some photographers, old school photographers, will use some old school tools, and these old school tools are curves. Now I used to teach how to get the best out of curves before we were editing with these raw editors such as Lightroom, Adobe Camera Raw, Capture One, etc. And this was the tool that we were using. We used them in association with something called luminosity masks, which was a way of calming down the aggressive behavior of curves on some of the adjacent tones we were trying to push. Now it's important to note that we don't have the option for luminosity masks in Lightroom, and so there is a great danger that we can actually damage images quite easily by trying to adjust their tonality using curves inside of a program like Lightroom. And because these are old school tools, we actually have access to much better tools in the basic panel, and these are of course shadows and highlights. Now, one of the things that most people are aware of when they're pulling their image into a raw editor, the initial preview that you see just momentarily might disappear for something altogether darker, and that's because it's discarding the JPEG preview that the camera created and creating a new profile for the raw editor Lightroom. And one of the things that will often change quite substantially is the shadows. Shadows are often made a lot brighter for JPEGs in camera using some of the features like Dynamic Range Optimizer in the Sony cameras. And this is not applied to the raw file. So we have to basically lighten up the shadows in post-processing using the shadow slider. So a lot of people, when they look at an image like this, it's absolutely nothing like what I remember seeing. And this is where, again, the cameras do struggle. Shooting into the light is one way to really make shadows dark. And the sky also has none of the drama and color that I was witnessing there. So the camera's actually failed quite badly at recording anything approaching what it was that I was actually seeing. And when a lot of people see an image like this, they're often confused about where they should start. And you certainly wouldn't start with white balance because we can't actually see any of the colors to adjust. So the sliders that are most obvious to adjust first are shadows and highlights. And so just by pushing these, and you'll notice that I'm not timid here. Don't start nudging sliders by 2 and 3 increments. It's basically would be like going to a golf course with only the putter. We really have to start off with a tool that can really drive the tonality in very large jumps. And so just be quite generous with your adjustments on those shadows and highlights adjustment if you are trying to see what's inside of the deep shadows and also the brightest highlights. And only then can we really turn our attention to other tools such as contrast and white balance, blacks and whites, etc. to optimize this image. Now, when people see where the image started, and yes, this is the same image, but when a lot of people see my finished image, they say, well, there must have been a lot of editing there. And so just to dispel the fact that we've made a huge difference in the image, but it actually doesn't take that long if you know the sliders to go to. And so what I've done is I've created a movie on my YouTube channel in the Lightroom section, and I've got just a specific group of movies where I only spend 1 minute making an edit, and this is one of those movies. I go from the original raw state right through to the finished edit in a minute, and so you don't have to be worried that some of these big changes do take a lot of time. So check that movie out. It's one of the typical workflows that I do use on dramatic landscapes where I do have those very dark shadows that I'm trying to check or put back into balance there. And the other thing that I would advise is, as you're reviewing images, don't just pass over images because they don't look good at first sight. If you were quite excited when you were taking the image, for instance, it is worth spending just 10 seconds or 20 seconds just exploring what it was that excited you to take that photograph in the first place. So this is the straight out of camera raw image, but if I just open up the shadows and bring down the highlights, and I've done a little bit of keystoning, which I'll talk to you about later because the tripod was on the ground and we had some converging verticals, we can see that we can bring a lot of information and life and vitality, and this is what actually excited me to take this image. It's I think it was yes, it's a 5-second exposure, but the guy basically with his mobile phone wasn't moving. I've also added or enhanced a little bit of the blue light coming from the mobile phone because this is the focal point of the image, and I wanted that as a complementary color to the warm colors around the doorway where this guy is standing. But the most important adjustments here was just adding one stop in exposure and really ramping up the shadows and then bringing down the highlights again. Now, a lot of the images that I'm shooting in difficult lighting situations, they don't really are faithful to what I was seeing. So a lot of them don't look that great when I first see the raw image. You'll also notice my very low vantage point for this image. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to crop and also open up those shadows. And you can see how much this image moves with just those adjustments. And again, this is basically a 1 or 2 minute edit to get to where I'm going. And this is really what I'm looking for. And I'll just go through a bunch of these. This is exposing for the highlights. We've got some very bright bokeh balls in the background using my 85 1.4. So I am pushing the hero figure maybe a stop darker than I would have liked. But if I got the correct exposure for the figure, I'm going to push those highlights in the background over the top. And I do want to put some detail and color back into that bokeh there. So the post-processing again brings that to life. So +1 on the exposure and +50 on the shadows, bringing that back to life. Also, you got backlit scenes such as with water or sky. You might want to open up the exposure so you get the perfect subject exposure, but would you do that at the risk of the background? And in many instances I will add some exposure to brighten up my subject, but not at the risk of losing the highlight in the background. And so again, post-processing to restore the tonality of my primary subject there. Again, obviously I don't want to get too much more exposure in camera, because if I do, I'm going to push some of that white plumage over the top, and then I'll lose the structure of that the plumage, which would be very sad in this instance, because I pretty much nailed the focus of this raptor in flight here. And this is the hero now. Is again just one stop extra in post-processing, and again +60 on the shadows, quite generous, but restoring the beautiful tonality to this flying bird. And again, now I could have opened up the exposure a little bit more in camera had it not been for that foreground. We got some bright elements in the foreground, and again, if I'd have opened up one stop in camera, I may have lost that detail. And so sometimes I'll also put in a little bit of a graduated filter over that over an overly bright bottom or top to the image, and we're going to be looking at that shortly. Graduated filters. Exposing for the highlights. If you've watched my preparing a camera for street photography in sunny weather, so I usually use something called the Sunny 16 rule. And this ensures the brightest highlights aren't overexposed. This can lead to some very dark shadows, as we see in this image. Now we've got a little bit of information in those dark shadows, and if you were following my shadow workflow for landscapes, you might want to open them up further so we can see the beautiful texture and detail. But actually actually it's detail in this instance that I don't want to see. So I'd actually do a negative shadows adjustment in this instance. I'd push them even darker so no one will be looking into those shadows. And this is the sort of drama that I wanted in this instance. Okay, and another example of moving shadows to the left rather than to the right. I could bring up much more detail in the rock faces behind this huge iceberg in Alaska, but in this instance I just want you to concentrate on the drama of the iceberg itself, the small bird just off to the right of that iceberg, and also the boat, a very small boat compared to that large iceberg. And I don't want you looking at the shadows in the background. Again, it's a way of controlling the communication and telling the story that I want to tell in this image. Now, I have encouraged you to be bold with those sliders, but in some instances you can be too bold with groups of sliders that together can create what's called artifacts, non-image data or shadows or highlights around objects that shouldn't really be visible. In many instances you can be very generous and get away with it, but in some instances you can't. So I've highlighted an example where extreme shadows and extreme highlights and together with a lot of clarity will start throwing off halos around the edges of the darker shapes going into this very bright sky. Be aware of this, because as soon as you start seeing this happen, you do need to back off on one of those sliders. In some instances there's another way of getting to where you want to go by using localized adjustment tools, but certainly backing off on the clarity or backing off on the negative highlights will restore or get rid of dark shadows or bright halos moving around subjects. So keep on the lookout for those. Another important panel is the HSL, Hue, Saturation and Luminance panel. Now, sometimes just a single color can be quite distracting. It sort of detracts from the main subject in many instances. In this particular portrait that I was shooting of Gilba Namala in the Northern Territories, the character is great and we've got a good complementary color to go with the character behind. Nicely out of focus because I've moved Gilba maybe a meter away from that background and we're using shallow depth of field, but he's wearing sort of this purple necklace and some blue purple tones on his shirt that I think detract. Now, just changing the color of Gilba's shirt isn't going to remove Gilba's personality. The likelihood that he owns this shirt now is probably remote, and so I have no problem with simply changing the color or desaturating that color that is getting in the way of this communication. Now, for somebody working for a newspaper, a photojournalist who's creating a document or record, they often need to be accurate and faithful to the subject, so they don't have the luxury of being able to move color in this way. Bizarrely or ironically, they can change to black and white and get rid of all color, but they can't modify a single or two or three colors individually. So it's just one of the rules and regulations that photojournalists have to abide to if they're not going to lose their job. Another example here is looking at this animal here. We have quite a vivid green background which doesn't seem to suit the animal itself, and one of the reasons this was captured at a zoo, not out in the wilds of Africa. And so just desaturating that color and moving the color from green maybe to yellow, we can get a background that doesn't fight or vie for attention with the primary subject. Remember, we got hue, saturation and luminance there, so you can not only just pick one, say the green, and move it to yellow, but you can also then desaturate that color, and you could also make that color darker to get the perfect background behind your primary subject. And this HSL will actually switch to a black and white panel, because it is possible to change the luminance of colors even when we've dropped to black and white. So yes, that sky is blue, even though we can only see it as a tone of gray now. But if we grab that blue and cyan slider and move them to the left, we could basically pull that blue sky right the way to black. I'm not sure that I would do that in every instance, but it just shows you the power of the HSL tools tools in that panel for targeting a specific color or colors and then moving them to where you want them to go. Okay, in this example, I've asked the question, who's looking at the gorilla or who's looking at the grass? That green is very vivid, and if you just wanted to pull the viewer's attention just to the gorilla and get them to completely ignore that green background, then we can again do that using the HSL panel. Another very powerful tool is Vignettes. Now, I've just created this outrageous claim here, and I've never checked to see how many photographers add vignettes and how often they do it. But vignettes are very prevalent in post-processing, I have to say that, and they predate programs like Lightroom and Photoshop. A lot of photographers have been adding vignettes for a very long time, and one of the reasons that photographers often like to do this is it creates this tunneling effect. It draws the viewer's attention away from the edges of the frame and draws them into the subject in the frame, and it's a very powerful tool for controlling communication. And so what I've said here is approximately 50% of all photographers vignette 50% of their images, and if this was anyway indeed accurate, we'd say that 1 in 4 images that we looked at ever would have a vignette applied, and it is a powerful tool and something should be explored. If you're not one of the 50% of those photographers, that's okay, but I did want to highlight how often the vignettes are used in post-processing. Now, I actually prefer the color priority version of the vignettes. There is a drop down menu with a couple of options there. The top 2 are the most common. The color priority isn't the default, but I actually prefer this. I think there's a little bit more control. There's a little bit less damage to the dark tones in the corners, and so I prefer to use color priority. So some people fall in love with vignettes so much that they start getting very aggressive with vignettes, and what I would encourage you perhaps not to do is get so aggressive that people are very aware of the vignettes as soon as they see the image. One of the things that does tend to happen as the image gets smaller and smaller on screen, the vignette tends to become more and more obvious, and so I would invite you to look at the grid view, and if you can see the vignette in the grid view, the thumbnail of your image, then you may have overcooked that vignette, so you might just want to back off. A good vignette should only really be noticeable after you've switched it off and people go, oh, the corners have got suddenly brighter. I wasn't even aware there was a vignette at play there. So as you can see from the other 2 images in that grid view, you'll see that it's not obvious there's vignettes on those, and indeed there almost certainly is vignettes on those other 2 images. Let's look at filters now. We're looking at graduated filters and radial filters. Now, this is another extremely powerful tool, and I have to say they're probably just as common as vignettes as powerful tools for post-processing images. Now, in this street photography image that I've captured here, I really want you to focus on the bridge and the guy pushing the pram over the bridge. The only problem with the communication of this is it is a very dark grey sky, but it's not recording as dark as I would like it. So what I'm going to do in post-processing is make it darker, so you're not actually going to be aware of that, and the bridge will become the hero, not the sky. So I've actually added 3 vignettes in this, 2 to the sky. Sometimes I add a second sky graduated filters, not vignettes, we're talking about graduated filters. I'll click and drag a second graduated filter above the first one. The first one usually is quite broad and will often come down slightly below the horizon line. The second one tends to just sit at the top of the sky. I'll sometimes even add a third graduated filter at the bottom of the image going up just to darken that foreground, and it's a way of sort of adding bookends to my image. I draw people away from both the top and bottom of the image, and I might also add a little bit of a vignette as well, quite a subtle vignette if I'm using these quite powerful graduated filters. So what this is doing is it's making you very aware now that the highlights on the bridge are the brightest highlights in the image, and that is the way I wanted to present this. If you are making adjustments to those sliders, and you've already got adjustments as soon as you come in, if you just want to zero all of those sliders, just hold down the Alt key or Option key, and then just you'll get the option to reset all sliders, or you can simply just double click that word and also zero the sliders. Now I've pulled all of those graduated filters off, you can see how damaging to the communication for me that sky actually was. It is overly bright, and I'll just go back a slide. You can see this is how I wanted. I wanted really quite a dark, oppressive sky because there was a storm coming in, and I dare say this guy is trying to get home before the rain starts falling quite heavily, and so this just wasn't carrying that communication for me. I've also added a graduated filter into this image to darken the blue sky. Some landscape photographers will do this with graduated filters in front of the lens. What happens if we do this in camera is we will darken everything that is going up towards the top of the image, including, in this instance, the top of the ice of this very bright iceberg in Alaska is also going a very dirty grey, and it wasn't. It's just that nearly 2 stops exposure is being darkened on that ice, and it's no longer very bright white. There is a way of restoring this, and this is something that we can't actually do with filters in front of camera lenses, and that is to use the range mask. We can actually restrict the darkening process just to a range of tones, or in this instance a range of colors. So I've clicked the range mask, set it to color, clicked on that eyedropper, and then dragged the eyedropper to pick up a range of those blues that I can see in the sky. And now this restores the tonality to the things that are not blue, such as the top of that iceberg. So again, I'll just go back. We can see that dirty top of the iceberg there because I've been applying that graduated filter to all information at the top of the frame. And now with the range mask, restoring the bright white tones of that iceberg there. An alternative to using a color range mask is to use a luminance range mask. Again, in this image taken in Alaska, we're lowering the top exposure of the sky by 1.5 stops. I basically click and drag. Just hold down the Shift key if you want to keep that graduated filter absolutely horizontal, so it's not coming across your image in a slightly crooked fashion. Then instead of selecting color, we select luminance from the range mask. Now we can, instead of choosing blue as the color we're protecting, we can choose the brightest tones and the darkest tones. So what I'm doing here is I'm also protecting the edges of the cliffs on the left and right from also the range mask, and we're also going to restore the highlights on the brightest tones. So you can see that my range mask now extends from 20 to 75, so the top 25 brightest tones will not be affected by this graduated filter, and also the darkest 20% of tones will also be protected. So this is a very clever way of doing graduated filters in post-production, and it does have an advantage over using graduated filters in camera. I'm not saying that there is no reason to use a graduated filter in camera, but certainly when we can separate out what colors we're darkening and what range of tones, it does give us a certain degree of advantages. Again, if you can get the exposure between the goalposts, there is little need to actually use a graduated filter in camera. But in some instances, skies are so bright, we often do use a graduated filter in order to help balance the exposure in a camera. I find them especially useful in camera to do them with seascapes, because we don't tend to have a lot going into the sky of a seascape in order that we have to unnaturally darken by using that filter. Some people will use them in camera, some people won't, but you do certainly explore them in post-production. Now we don't have to just restrict our graduated filters to tonality. We don't always have to be just lowering the luminance of, say, a sky. We can also have control over a number of different other areas of that tonality and or color. We've got a lot of sliders down below that exposure slider that we can play with. So in this particular instance, I've decided to also explore moving the color temperature as well as the exposure. Now there was a natural transition from blue to orange in the dawn light that I was photographing in Sydney here, but because I was using a short telephoto lens, I'm actually going underneath that transition from orange to blue. So in order to communicate what I'm experiencing with that color palette in the environment, I'm actually feeding it back into this image. Admittedly, it's a little bit lower than it was, that blue tone, but the blue was there just sort of out of frame, and I'm bringing it back into play now by moving the white balance slider. Now if you look at that little red box below in the bottom right hand corner, I'll just wave my icon so you can see it down here. Okay, so if we collapse the little arrow so we can collapse all of the sliders, we get one single slider called Amount. Now this is a very useful tool if you've got like 3 or 4 sliders at play and you want to decrease them all by 10 or 20% all incrementally rather than moving every single slider. You can do this just by collapsing that graduated filter panel and then just moving the amount slider, and all sliders that inside of that panel will be now moved incrementally. And then if you need to move just an individual slider, just open that back up and then grab that individual slider handle. Now sometimes when this is a technique that I actually use quite a lot, especially when I'm shooting at dawn and dusk with telephoto lenses, and so you may notice this in my folio work quite a lot, is I am pulling a little bit of blue at the top when we got those dawn transitions, and sometimes I need to actually pull them quite aggressively in order for that blue to appear, especially if they're orange. If they're the opposite end of the color spectrum, I will need to pull that color temperature slide quite aggressively, in this instance -76, in order to feed that blue back into this image. And one of the reasons for this is I'm using a much longer telephoto lens. We've gone from that short telephoto now to 373mm on my 100-400 lens in order to frame this shot. Now I really wanted you just to look at the monkeys, and you probably already are. They're a funny family of monkeys, these. But there are a few things when I'm trying to perfect this as a folio that I'm not entirely happy with, and that is some of the green tones in the background are getting a little bit light in the lower half of the image, and so I don't want the eye to drop away and move to the background in this instance. Now, so what I've chosen to do, and it is sort of less important in this instance, but it is something that I will do when I'm going round to my second round edits just to perfect a folio image, is I'll go in and maybe use a graduated filter just to darken that unnaturally lower half of the image. Okay, and there is my finished image where I've just darkened off those brighter background highlights by a stop or two, just so we get a more balanced image. And now I have my folio image that I'm quite proud of. Another option to, instead of doing graduated filters, is to do radial filters, and this is very useful for just shining a little bit more light into an area of the image. Now this was a darkroom technique I used to use before even using it in Photoshop and Lightroom. Typically we're just sort of burning a little bit more exposure or dodging a little bit of exposure into the image, and if we're withholding or making an area brighter, that would typically be called dodging. And so I'm adding a little bit of light just onto the face of this woman, just half a stop, but it does make sure that people gravitate towards the brightest tones in the image. Okay, some people might choose to do it with a fill flash just to add a little bit of light to the foreground subject, but here I'm basically using fill flash in post-production by using a radial filter with an extra half stop. Now, one of the great things is we can actually fine tune that. We don't just have to have an ellipse or a circle of extra light. We can actually remove some of that light, and here I'm going in and picking up that brush tool. Now in the toolbar at the bottom, if you can't see the toolbar in your Lightroom, just press the T key so you get that toolbar. You've got the option to show selected mask overlay, or you can simply press the O key on the keyboard, and you can see where you've been adding light to this image. And then if you don't want to add light, maybe you're getting a little bit of halo going off into the background, you can just hold down the Alt or Option key and then start erasing that from the radial filter, so we're only applying light to the face. Now that really is emulating fill flash because it's not extending unnaturally now to the background. So a great useful technique, and I do use this one a lot, also with the graduated filters. Okay, let's look at lens corrections now. Okay, we've done a lot of the heavy lifting with sort of the color and tonality now, but there are some things that I also like to pay attention to. Now in this particular image, we're using quite a cheap kit lens on an A6000, I think it was, or an NEX6, which even predates the 6000, and you can see we've got quite a lot of barrel distortion. You can see those verticals on the right side here. They're bowing unnaturally. They're not bowing in real life. That is a distortion from the lens itself. Now we can actually remove those distortions because Lightroom can build up the nature or characteristics of individual lenses when used on a specific camera. And so by coming to the lens corrections panel and then choosing enable profile corrections, we can get Lightroom to correct those distortions. Now if you're using a very old version of Lightroom that predates the lens, don't expect this to happen, okay, because you have to update Lightroom periodically, so it adds new camera profiles and also new lens profiles, so it can make these sorts of corrections. For some cameras they can actually make these corrections in camera as well, and sometimes they can't, so we do want to check whether that's possible or not. There is a lens correction that Lightroom can't fix, and often the cameras can't fix it either, and this is something called color fringing. It's slightly different from chromatic aberration, which is a misalignment of the red, green and blue wavelengths on high contrast lines. You might see that by zooming into the corners. Now as soon as chromatic aberration is fixed, we can get rid of those very small thin color halos coming off harsh edges. But one of the colors that isn't removed from that tends to happen, and it's not always at the edges. It's where you've got darker tones with very bright tones behind them or abutting those dark tones, and this is often referred to as color fringing, and they're often apparent when we're using very wide aperture lenses. So if you're using an f1.8 or 1.4 lens wide open with very bright tone behind your subject, you'll often see this color fringing. Now we can actually go some way to removing this partially or fully inside of Lightroom. We need to go over to the manual panel, so come away from profile, click on the manual tab there. Once we're in the manual, and we're in the manual now, pick up the eyedropper, which you can see docked here. Okay, we then take that into the image, and we actually see a magnified view of pixels. That grid that you can see here now in the center are magnified pixels. Now there are no purple pixels on this guy's hand. That is the color fringing, and so if we target one of those purple pixels, and that magnified view helps us target just the one we want, click on it, and then that color fringing can disappear. Okay, so in this instance it's disappeared. Sometimes it can be a little bit aggressive and desaturate too much, and so you may want to back that off on the amount slider there. So let's also take a look at something called default settings. Now most people will start off with a raw image, basically in its raw state with just a few minor adjustments that typically raw editing programs want to apply for you. Most of them do it. They don't leave the image totally raw, and that's one of the reasons you'll find some people arguing between the benefits of one raw processor compared to another. Images will look different unedited in different raw processors, and that's because each manufacturer of the software likes to do a few initial adjustments by applying a profile, by maybe applying a little bit of sharpening, etc. Okay, so one of the things that I will typically do is I don't typically start with completely raw on a specific camera that I'm using. I will override that default. Now, it's very important that you start with an image completely in the raw state before you make any modifications, and only make the modifications that you want to be applied to every image that's being imported from the memory card. Okay, there is a way of overriding it, but typically you only want to apply adjustments that you know you want to apply to every image from that camera. If once you've made those adjustments, you'll see here, I'm just giving you some examples here, adding 1/3 of a stop exposure, adding 10 contrast, bringing the highlights down slightly, bringing the shadows up, adding a little bit of clarity and a little bit of vibrance. Now, if that is going to be my starting point, because that's typically what I will do with at least half the images, then I'm going to override Adobe's default and create my own custom default. And I do this by holding down the Alt or Option key in the Develop module, and then click Update to Current Settings, and it'll just update the default for that specific camera. Okay, some of the other things that you might want to consider adding to a new default, for instance, is the lens corrections. If you are going to add that, just select Auto from the setup. Don't select one lens, otherwise that lens profile will become the default for all lenses attached to that camera. Just select the word Auto. Okay, just notice that we have the built-in lens profile applied. Just that little warning there. If Adobe picks up that there is a profile applied, you might want to just click on that eye just to work out what lens corrections are being done at a raw level inside the camera. And in this instance, it was the remove chromatic aberration has already been removed in the camera. Now, you will see on Sony cameras there is an option, I think it's on page 2, called Lens Comp, and it will split up the lens compensations that can be done in camera in those menus, such as shading in the corners, distortions, and also chromatic aberration. So you can also, if they're not being applied in the camera, you could certainly want to apply them in post-production. What I want to do now is I want to spend some time looking at black and white conversions. Sometimes I see on the forums is some people will put a color image beside a black and white image and say, which one do you prefer? Now, generally I'm not going on it image by image. I've got a specific thing I want to communicate, and sometimes black and white suits what it is that I'm trying to say. I'm not often or always just choosing the one that looks prettiest, and often when you put a color image right next to a black and white image, it's very difficult working out which one looks better. Okay, so usually you should look at them separately, not side by side, and I've got one example later. Okay, so why choose to convert to black and white at all? And one of the main reasons that I will choose is drama. If I a big scene that has that I was bowled over when I first saw it, I want to really put on a lot of drama, and actually the color isn't actually contributing to that drama, then I may consider changing a whole series of images to black and white in this instance. So if color is a distraction to what it is you're trying to say, then do certainly consider black and white, especially if it's more about tone or light and shade than it is about color. Now the image, this image was actually captured not at the early morning or the late evening when the colors can be rich and we can get a lot of drama and color. It was actually captured in the middle of the day, so the color really was quite insipid and flat, and so I didn't feel that it was helping the drama of the situation at all. So I was quite happy to convert this one into black and white. Another example is sometimes again the color's not contributing, and it's definitely in this instance the light and shade, or the shadows that is extending into this image. The shadow of the tree really needs to be highlighted for me in this image, because this is what I noticed in this scene. And certainly by dropping the image into black and white and darkening off that blue sky, I can really make the shadow coming off this tree very dramatic indeed. I recently was in Japan photographing at a sumo stable, sumo wrestlers in training, and we had some fluorescent lights and also some daylight coming in from some high windows top right of this image that you're looking at. And again, the mismatch of color light sources was not helpful, and but what I did like was the backlit illumination hitting the edges of the bodies, and I really wanted to highlight this in the post-processing. So I decided to post-process the whole series in black and white, and now sort of the sweat on the bodies and the shape of the bodies are really enhanced by converting these images to black and white. I'm predominantly a color photographer, but certainly when I do know the power of black and white in some instances. Sometimes it might just be the client wants to have a preference, and that might dictate the way you light something, but certainly in some situations black and white carries certainly a different style of story and communication. And I think there's nothing better to highlight the way that black and white can be dramatic and carry more weight, especially drama in a scene, is with this image that I captured of the A-bomb dome in Hiroshima in Japan. This was directly below the hypercenter of the blast, and stands as a monument now to peace. Now, when I'm looking at this image, I think the color of the image, the color again is getting in the way. As a historical period piece with drama and weight of communication, I really was quite keen now to drop a whole series of images that I captured in Hiroshima into a black and white, and use black and white as the narrative. It also gave that historical feel to what it is that I'm photographing. And certainly in say another example, this was actually the actual hypercenter. The A-bomb dome was a block or two away from the hypercenter. We got this guy in what appears to be a medical coat coming past. This hypercenter monument actually is next to a medical clinic, and so I really wanted to tie these two elements together and also use the light and shade. Now I could see the shadow, and I was actually waiting for that shadow. I was aware of the light that was happening at this time, and it's very close to 8:15, which is when the bomb detonated all of those years ago. So again, I'm trying to match as much of the communication as I can leverage, and black and white is one of those components that I'm using to tell the story. When I was in the sand dunes and I showed you the what if scenario early in the presentation about would we go in color, should we warm the colors up, should we use pastel colors, and for me, when I created these series of images, I was thinking of the drama of an Ansel Adams shot, which I started this black and white category with, and that is using not thinking about the color at all, but just using the shape and the way the light interacts with the shape of the sand dunes. So this is really just a story about light and shade. Now, one of the things that we can pick up right at the top of the basic panel when we're looking at profile, and typically it'll be set to Adobe Color or Adobe Standard using older versions of Lightroom, we've got those four little white squares that you can see there. and if we click on them, it opens up the profile browser. And if you go to the black and white section of the profile browser, you can roll your mouse over and look at variations, flavors of black and white. And if we go right to the bottom of those options there, I think there's about 17 black and white options, we'll see the options that we used to use when using analog black and white film by pulling colored filters. Colored filters would darken their complementary color, so an orange filter would darken a blue sky, and we could certainly create different renditions by darkening certain colors and lightening others. And so this is a way of, before we even move any sliders, is getting a look at how we would prefer to use as a starting point before we start adding graduated filters, vignettes, doing some maybe localized adjustments and global adjustments. And now what I've got here is a tutorial that I've often used at workshops to highlight how powerful black and white processing is when we're in control. Now I don't always think that the best way to convert black and white is with a single click or a preset that you may have downloaded, because you are telling a story, and where you choose to darken the image and where you choose to lighten the image is a very important part. And Lightroom will never know what it is that's important in the image, so you have to go in and manually select areas and choose what to darken and what to lighten. Now we can certainly start off with a preset. So this is the finished version, so I just wanted to show you how different a color unedited version is from the black and white edited version. I would hope to think that your attention is being now drawn very quickly to the huts inside of these images. It's in California on the other side of the Sierra Nevada. It's also where Ansel Adams used to work, and so this was also an inspiration for me when making this black and white conversion. And I've used a whole variety of tools to make this black and white conversion. So one, I'll just click from color to black and white, which is the treatment. I might go into the black and white mix and start also darkening some colors and lightening others just by clicking and dragging. I'll add some graduated filters. There's actually 4 graduated filters in this image, 3 in the sky, 1 in the foreground. I'll go in and do some localized dodging and burning. You'll see at the top of the hills on the right side there, I've removed very carefully, because I'm actually wanting to stay behind that range of mountains there and not start spilling into the sky itself. So we've got a number of tools to work with. This one is called Auto Mask. Just be aware that with Auto Mask, if you need to zoom in on that edge occasionally just to make sure you're not running down artifacts along that edge. Auto Mask is very good where we've got a clearly defined edge, but if you run with Auto Mask over a very soft diffused edge, you can build up these artifacts or blocky patterns in those areas, and so in those instances you just need to switch the Auto Mask off and just go and paint a little bit more carefully. Now if that is something that, a skill that you want to work with, certainly head over to my website, go to the download section. Now I've got the movies walking you through step by step, but I also give you access to download the raw file used in the tutorial, and I've got many of these tutorials on my website, and they're free tutorials. Now if they do improve your learning no end, then I'm happy for you to make a small donation to support me in supporting the community, but they are free to download if that's what you choose to do. Just highlighting, we've always got those choice for black and white profiles. This is a fairly new addition, so if you can't see those profiles, it's maybe because your version of Lightroom is older than the last few current versions. And there is a color side by side with the black and white, and I actually don't like to present this in folio work. I like to keep sections of my folio just black and white and then move and make that transition to just color rather than putting them side by side as we can see on this slide. I don't think it helps to showcase them side by side at all. Okay, so once we're just looking at black and white and color is out of the equation, then we can fully appreciate the strengths of a black and white image and then move back just to a color image only. Okay, so here is an inset of the color, and again you can see how dramatically different they could be. One is a process color, one is a black and white. Okay, and again, just to showcase a before and after. As I said, I normally wouldn't showcase these side by side and give people the choice. I will be making the choice to say whether this part of my photo stays color or goes into black and white. So let's look at toning now. We looked at this image earlier. Now you'll see before we weren't fully black and white in that processed image, and certainly there's more colors in this version. This is basically what I would describe as the full color. I've edited it tonally and with graduated filters, but there's a whole range of colors at play here. I actually think there are too many colors. I don't want to go full black and white, but I want to just limit or restrict the color palette just to the dominant colors. And there is a way that of doing this that I'm very fond of, and that is lowering the vibrance slider, which will pull saturation from most colors. The most saturated colors will tend to stay richer for longer, and then by pulling the saturation slider to the right, I will fully restore the dominant colors. The more pastel colors or more mute colors will be fully desaturated or mostly desaturated. So this does have an effect of putting the image sort of in a transition, sort of a halfway color, halfway black and white. But just by reducing or restricting the color palette to fewer colors does have a strength of communication that I am very fond of. Here's another full color image. We've got some green tones that I'm not very fond of, especially quite close to the warm skin tones here. So another technique I've used here is again lean on that vibrant slider to the left to pull out most of the colors, and then use the temperature slider to decide whether the image needs to be warm or cool. You'll still see that there are still some subtle colors in, like such as the lips and the color of the iris of the eyes a little bit different. So we're not going full sepia, we're just going sort of mostly sepia, if you like. So this is another powerful tool for toning an image. If you wanted to really highlight some of the tones inside of this image, such as the eyes, you could go in with the adjustment brush, use maybe the temperature slider, saturation, maybe a little bit of clarity to really make those eyes pop, and then just paint them in very carefully, or use that auto mask feature just to stay behind the edges of those iris of the eyes to color those eyes. And this may be a little bit unnatural, but I'm proving a point, which is we could fully restore or even exaggerate and really enhance the color of eyes in this instance on top of this sepia image. And this one it was more with the natural color of the eyes on a closer shot, and again just maybe brushing a little bit of extra saturation over the lips to fully restore the color of that area of the image. Okay, so this is on a very stormy, wet day, full color, and I'm actually looking to do a technique which I'm also very fond of, called split toning. Split toning allows you to choose a color for the highlights and typically a complementary color for the shadows. It's something that Hollywood is very fond of doing, and a couple of the favorite color combinations that Hollywood may choose to use is orange and teal. Sort of an orange will sort of populate the skin tones of the actors, and then a cooler tone filling the shadows. We're not going fully black and white and then split toning. We're leaving in the image in color, but leaning the highlights towards a warmer tone and the shadows towards a cooler tone. And what I'm doing is I'm forcing the complementary colors in this instance. And again, you can see this at play inside of an image like this, where we're leaving the natural color, but then taking the shadows and basically making them a lot cooler than they would appear naturally. So again, force complementary colors to create these toned images. So we can actually convert images to black and white as well before split toning, so there's no natural color left now. And this is the traditional way of split toning that would have occurred in a darkroom, okay, because this technique predates software such as Lightroom and Photoshop. And so we're adding just a warmer color now to the highlights, Okay, just click on the little color swatch there and pick your tone. If you're not comfortable with clicking it off there, this will actually open up a color picker so you can pick it more easily. And then what we can do is click on the shadow tone and choose a complementary cooler tone for those shadows. So now we've got warm highlights, cool shadows for our split tone black and white conversion. And just to show you how powerful that can be on an image, the inset is the unprocessed version, which are predominantly warm tones. I had noticed a few cooler tones in the architecture, so I really wanted to enhance that by swinging all of the slightly darker tones to that cool blue cyan, and all of the warmer tones to that yellow orange colors there. Now I actually share some Lightroom presets for doing this with a single click, and if you do head over to my website and look for downloads, Lightroom presets, you should be able to download those. Again, they're free. Again, if you after having tried them, you like them, just consider making a small donation to help me with the time I put into both making them and also sharing them. Let's take a look at texture and dehaze, two quite powerful features. Texture is a very new feature in the very latest version of Lightroom that I'm using, and so sometimes people use negative clarity in older versions, but I'm not fond of that adjustment. A lot of people use positive clarity, and I'm okay with that, but negative clarity is quite a I have to say, a disturbing look. One of the things that Lightroom doesn't have compared to Photoshop is the Gaussian blur, lens blur, surface blur filters that does create beautiful smooth tones. So texture is a way of creating more sophisticated soft tones now inside of Lightroom without having to go into Photoshop. Now in this particular instance, I've just applied it globally. It's holding on to the sharp detail, so it's not diffusing or blurring everything. It's just blurring predominantly the texture, but it's also blurring the wall this woman is standing in front of, as well as the skin tones. So if you were just trying to create an adjustment that just targeted the tones that you want to work with, I would encourage you, again, just picking up the adjustment brush, loading or taking away the texture, and then painting with that. Now you'll notice the overlay color, I've switched the overlay on, is a very similar color to both the skin tones and also the background tone. If that makes it difficult to paint with any degree of accuracy, if you hold down the Shift key and press the O key, you can actually change the color of the overlay. And if you keep holding down the Shift key and press O a number of times, you can go through a couple of colors, white and black, and then return back to red, which is the default. I call this my Princess Fiona workflow. Again, it's very useful if you're painting with a red mask over colors which are red naturally, and that does make it difficult in those instances. And so this is a before, and this is an after, just being a lot more flattering. And I have to say, if you're using some very expensive ultra sharp primes, they can be very unkind to people's skin, and we often more aware of their flaws than we were when we were actually looking at them with our own vision. And another way of working with that texture is a positive adjustment instead of a negative adjustment. This is a before, and this is an after. I really wanted to highlight this eye of this crocodile, so I've come up with both clarity and also texture, which is really enhancing the texture or pattern inside of this crocodile's eye. Now I've also pulled down the surrounding tone. Again, it's that dodging and burning, maybe using vignettes, graduated filters, just to control the tonality, so I get you to look exactly where I want you to look, so I can tell my story. Another very popular one that came in a few years back was something called the Dehaze filter. Very popular for people wanting to remove very flat looking images, maybe been photographing through an airplane window or underwater, or just a very flat, and it's just a way of unpacking that image. It leans on lots of tools inside of Photoshop, and you can come back a very long way to restore a very dramatic image. So let's take a look at detail now. These are often just finishing up in an image. This is often what I do to an image as the last few adjustments. I'll come in and I'll just check the sharpening. Now typically you may want to add sharpening to your default that we talked about earlier. You might, if you always add a little bit of sharpening, why don't you just add that extra sharpening to your default. But one of the other things that I would also encourage you to do is when you're deciding how much sharpening you like, just zoom into 1:1 or use that little preview window there. If you just click on the little triangle to expand that dialog, you will see the preview. If that dialog box is collapsed, if you click on the information or exclamation mark there, you will be zoomed in. You can't get a true idea of how much sharpening is being applied just at the fit in view, where you can see the whole image. So I would encourage you to do that before doing any sharpening. Next thing I would do when you're sharpening is also work with that masking slider. Now if you hold down the Alt or Option key, it's the Alt key on a PC, the Option key on a Mac, as if you hold that down whilst dragging the masking slider, everything that turns black in this threshold view is going to be protected from the sharpening process. And one of the reasons you do want to protect those tones is because you don't want to exaggerate detail often in the out of focus bokeh areas. You don't want to enhance noise in those areas. You also want to protect skin from over sharpening, and so this is a very good way of controlling exactly where your image is sharpened, and mostly we just want to sharpen the edges of our subject. This is typically very important when we're sharpening very high ISO images. For instance, this tree frog that I shot on one of my workshops was captured at ISO 5000, and if you're viewing this movie in 4K, you'll notice how well I'm suppressing the noise for an image captured at ISO 5000. Now this does take a little bit of work in post-processing, so what has happened here is I've used a very gentle amount of noise reduction in that detail panel, but I've also moved the masking slider quite high up to a level of 80 to protect those out of focus areas from aggressive sharpening or exaggeration of the noise there. So those are my global edits. And the next slide is I will then come in with a localized edit, this time using a radial adjustment, and now I'm applying my noise reduction to those red overlay areas there at maximum plus 100 noise reduction. Now I can fine tune that by coming in with the brush and then just brushing around the edges of the frog, so noise reduction is applied right up to the edges of the frog. This actually stops me having to brush the entire image with an adjustment brush. I can do most of the work with just a radial filter and then just fine tune the rest of it with that brush. If you take a look at this workflow applied on this image captured at even higher ISO, this time 8000 ISO, if you're viewing this on a large screen, you should be able to see the noise in the background here. Now one of the things that happens with noise, we're very much aware of the noise over smoother areas of tone, so you'll be less aware of the noise over the little bird in the center of the screen. So one of the other things that I can encourage you to do if you're trying to keep noise levels low is try to avoid underexposure in camera. If we also underexpose at high ISO and then raise the exposure in post, the noise will look a lot more aggressive. So you can see in the histogram that I'm showing here, I'm keeping the darker tones off that back wall. I'm trying not to underexpose this image. This will also improve this post-production workflow as well if we optimize the exposure in camera. And here is the cleaned up image. You can see beautifully smooth bokeh around that bird, and that is using exactly the same workflow there. Just 15-20 noise reduction in the detail panel. Make sure we've raised the masking slider perhaps to 80 or so, and then using local noise reduction. Now as we apply that radial filter, you'll have to uncheck the invert box to make sure the adjustment is happening outside of the radial filter, not inside the radial filter, and that then becomes this really most powerful of tools when we're working with very high ISO images. And I can carry on this. We keep pushing the ISO even higher, and now we've gone up to 12,800. Obviously full frame sensors are a little bit more are a little bit better at this than crop sensors, but we can see how much information we can extract quite cleanly by using these techniques that I'm using here. Another thing that while we're looking at detail is when we are doing our landscapes at maybe f11, this one's actually captured at f13, we've got a few sensor spots that we can actually see. This is just little bits of dust sitting on the sensor. Now I typically try and clean the sensor each time I've been changing lenses. At the end of the day, just blow it out with a rocket blower, but in this instance I've got a couple of sensor spots, maybe 3 or more that I can see. I'll just point to them here. There's one in the sky, and there's one over on this extreme edge, and there's just a very subtle one down in the light tones by this building here. So if I want to make sure that these are not obvious in my folio, I'll just go make sure that I've retouched them out in post-processing. So I'm come to the spot removal tool, and if we go into the toolbar, one of the things that can help you find all of the spots more easily is just clicking the visualize spots checkbox. Move that slider backwards and forwards until you get the best view of the sensor spots, and now quite quickly you're going to see the spots very clearly, and even that subtle one now is not so subtle anymore because I'm seeing all 3 spots. In fact, there's another 4th one, quite subtle now, but just another one that I might go in and remove as well. And obviously if that gets more than 3 or 4 spots each time I'm editing my landscape images, I am just going to clean that sensor. Okay, another thing that we can do, and it's not just for removing dust spots, but it's actually trying to remove distracting elements within the image. Now, when this gets really challenging, I will take an image into Photoshop, but if it's fairly straightforward, I will just do this with the spot removal tool as well. So I will just go straight in, and instead of just clicking on the spot, I will click and drag along the line. So this little line that was coming off the back of the bird, it's a little bit of a tag that this bird of prey, because this was at a raptor center, it's not a wild bird, and so here I can just remove it from view in the spot removal. So let's look at another powerful feature in Lightroom. I'm not going to have time to go in every feature, but you're certainly looking at certainly what I find are the most powerful features that are common in my image editing. And this one is in the transform panel. In very earlier versions of Lightroom, it used to be stacked in with the lens correction, but this is not typically a distortion created by the lens being poorly made, such as barrel distortion or pincushion distortion. This is created, or these converging verticals are created by tilting a camera with an ultra wide angle lens either down or up, and what happens is the verticals of this bridge here, Sydney Harbour Bridge, are being unnaturally lent in. Now we don't remember the converging verticals leaning quite so severely because we don't have ultra wide angle lenses with our human vision, so these are exaggerated by the camera and lenses that we're using. So I have no problem with taking these out whatsoever, and the way we can do that is go into the transform. Now more than 50% of the time just clicking on the word auto, it's the upright feature, it'll often find out what is the problem and just correct it. I would come down and choose the checkbox constrain crop. It will get rid of any unnatural canvas that it's had to impose on the image, so you might see the image magnify slightly in order to clean up the image. Often the auto can't do it automatically, and we have to go into manual or guided. Here I'm working with the guided transform. And the guided transform basically just means that I'm going to use this tool here to fully correct this image. Now the way I'm doing this is I'm basically just clicking and dragging down each vertical, 2, and then across this horizontal 3, and as we add in a second and third line, the image starts to be corrected, and I've actually added a 4th one at the bottom of the image. I will then come into the crop overlay, and then I might fine-tune the crop. In some instances I might just pull the image a little bit smaller, so I've got a little bit more flexibility about how I compose that image before I select OK. I personally believe everything that we do in Lightroom can be quite quickly mastered as soon as we learn what the tools do and how to use those tools appropriately. There are some things that are a little bit more challenging, and so I'll just cover those very briefly. Now I have lots and lots of Photoshop movies as well as Lightroom movies for these slightly more complex things I'm about to show you now. First thing off is, before we start doing any manipulations inside of Photoshop, one of the things that we can do inside of programs is start putting images together. It's the beginnings of photo montage or compositing, where we realize that one image can't tell our entire story, so we start putting images together. Now you can sort of do this a little bit in the print module, but it's a little bit clunky, and so it's really where you might want to leave Lightroom and come into a program like Photoshop, where we can extend the canvas area out and start tiling images together in order to create one image, which is a composite of images put side by side. When we put 2 images together, they're often referred to as diptychs, and 3 images triptychs, and this is a way of extending the narrative with more than one image. In this example, for instance, I've photographed this 4-wheel drive on the beach. I've approached the 4-wheel drive, and there's this great character talking, having a conversation on his phone, and instead of talking to the driver, I'm chatting with his dog. And so this extends the narrative, because without that second image, you don't know my relationship with this 4-wheel drive that I was passing while I was walking down the beach. Likewise, if we get a landscape view of a forest, we can't fully appreciate how impenetrable that forest may be unless we take a close-up. And so sometimes putting a close-up next to a zoomed out shot together in the same canvas area is a great way of extending that communication or narrative. We'll go back to that crocodile eye image that we saw earlier. Okay, so taking one image of the eye, and maybe you want to see what else do bits of the crocodile look at. So without showing the entire crocodile, which could have been an option, I'm just showing you what his fabulous tail looks like just underneath his head there. One of the things that we can do when we don't have to leave Lightroom is we can now stitch multiple images. So it's a reason that if your wide angle lens isn't wide enough, we can do panoramic stitching. We can also do high dynamic range stitching as well without leaving Lightroom. So Lightroom is certainly getting more powerful as it gets more mature. This is one that I'm going to show you, which is definitely a Photoshop only technique. Now, in this image that I've converted to black and white again, I think I've got what I think is the perfect sky to this scene. What you can't see in this particular image though was the huge crashing waves that was crashing into and over the hero rock. Now I did wait for another 5 minutes and there was a gale force wind blowing towards me, but I waited, I stuck it out, I waited to capture one of these huge waves crashing into the rock. But unfortunately, when this big huge wave crashed into the rock, the sky, the dramatic sky, was no longer as dramatic as it was in that previous image. So I've taken the image, and really what I want to communicate is the crashing waves and the dramatic sky. I really want to compress that 10 minutes that I spent photographing this rock into one image. So I've taken two images into Photoshop and I've put them as layers, one above another, and I've tried as best I can to align the wave image with the sky image there. And now all I need to do is mask that area of sky and rock away so the two images become one. And this is definitely something that Photoshop is a great tool for creating a composite image. Now some people don't want to composite, and I understand, and photojournalists obviously can't composite, but when you're trying to tell a story and you can tell it with more than one image in the same canvas area, and this is something that you want to do, then Photoshop is a program that is going to give you access to those tools. Here's another example that's typically a technique often used in real estate photography, where you get the hero shot of the last light of day over the building, but you also want the building coming to life with the twilight, with the electric lights inside the building coming on. Now I had to wait until there was actually no ambient light left around in the sky at all before capturing this next shot. This next shot was actually photographed with a completely black sky. All I've done is I've put that top layer, I've aligned it to the bottom layer, which was quite easy because both images were captured on a tripod, and then I've just put that top layer to the light and blend mode, and this just adds the pixels that are lighter on this layer to the pixels that are darker underneath. So this is a pre-dawn shoot, and I'm perfectly happy with this shoot. I use this shot as one of my folio images of Melbourne in winter at or just before dawn. But if a client was to say, oh, we actually wanted the sun rising, and you're trying to please somebody else, then it is possible to add the rising sun. And you can basically just pull down a file of maybe sun with some flare, add it as a layer, maybe add it to the screen or light and blend mode, do a little bit of masking. Also got to add a little bit the rising sun in the reflection as well, and then your work is done. This image was captured in a studio, and obviously it's very difficult to create lots of snow effects in a studio without doing a lot of work then to clean up your own studio. So this snow scene was actually added in post-production, again just using a stock image of a snow flurry and then just using a few blend modes to create that. And also the flare coming in the top right hand corner is also a post-production flare technique there. I also was sent over to Japan with Ben Q to do a composite portrait shoot. This is the same woman in this kimono. She's handing the umbrella that she's holding on the left to herself on the right, and this was just what's called a fixed position composite. Is you just put the camera on a tripod, move the model, and take a second image, and then just add the two images together. And it only takes 10 seconds, to be honest, to actually composite these, so long as you get the workflow right in capture. If you're looking at acquiring some of those compositing skills, then the first 3 tutorials on my website, they're all free. You get the raw images to work with, maybe a JPEGs in the third one actually, and then you can go through 90% of the techniques that you'll need for all compositing, I think, are sort of outlined in these 3 basic movies. These 3 compositing projects form the backbone or basis of how Photoshop likes to work quickly in compositing workflows, and so it's a great education if this is something that you're wanting to get into. And it does form a 12-week course at a number of colleges of further education for students wanting to get to grips with Photoshop. To give you some more examples of why we might need to leave Lightroom and go into a program like Photoshop, is this image was captured of this longboarder coming around this bend at really quite fast. He was motoring, he was traveling as fast as some motorcycles would navigate this corner, but in many respects it looks like he's stationary because the very fast shutter speed has frozen him, and so it almost looks like he might just fall off the back of a stationary longboard. And so in post-production I've just selected the area around the longboarder and then applied something called a path blur. I've shaped the blur in this arc to emulate his motion through this corner. Another tool or a workflow that I might do in Photoshop rather than Lightroom is something quite extensive retouching where it might be beyond the capabilities of the spot removal tool, or it might just take too long. The spot removal tool does, it's labor intensive inside of Lightroom, where moving pixels inside of Photoshop is actually very, very fast. And so I'll typically just edit in, open this up in Photoshop, and we'll do the work in Photoshop, hit save, and this edited version will appear alongside the original version, the original raw file inside of Photoshop. The important aspect of that workflow is just choose the edit in from Lightroom, save, don't choose where to save to, and by default Lightroom will re-import that edited version. So what I'm doing here is I'm working non-destructively, because I'm doing this on a separate layer, is I'm using something called the patch tool. Photoshop has this algorithm called content aware, and so it can content aware fill things that you've moved out of the way because they're distractions inside of the images. And you can see even just with a very simple click drag around your subject, move to one side, it replaces it to sky. 90% of the time it does a seamless transition, something that Lightroom would struggle with. If you get an image like this inside of Lightroom and you've got that sort of one gap in between those 2 uprights of this Torii gate in Japan, that's quite a lot of work with the patch tool, and you will get very frustrated. Whereas if you work in the patch tool inside of Photoshop, it can be fixed so that most people won't even notice it in just a few seconds, and I only spent a few seconds there. I could probably do a little bit of further work to make that more unnoticeable than it is already. This was a little bit more work, I have to say, is capturing this bird coming into nest. We've got a tree in the background, and I do want to extend the canvas. That's right the edge of the frame there, and I wanted to extend a little bit more sky onto the right side to create this square composition. So all of that I've managed to do inside of Photoshop. Something, again, Lightroom can't go anywhere near these type of workflows. The great thing for Lightroom users, because it's the Creative Cloud, if you've got Lightroom Creative Cloud, it means you already have Photoshop. You just need to download it. It's part of the photographer's plan or the full plan, and so you can get to grips with working this companion piece of software to Lightroom. This is an example where the image was actually captured in 3:2. If a client says we need it in the 16:9 aspect ratio, if I crop to 16:9, I would crop into the top of his hat, or I would crop in and lose the majority of his hand. So what I want to do is I don't want to crop into the figure at all. I just want to extend the background out into those empty areas. So I've extended the canvas out into 16:9, and then using something called content aware scale, I've just stretched the image, and Photoshop knows where my primary subject is because I've made a mask for that subject, and I've just stretched out the street scene, the blurry street scene in the background to create my 16:9 aspect ratio crop. Okay, one of the most advanced Photoshop techniques for skin retouching is something called frequency separation. Yes, you saw earlier we were just softening up the skin a little bit in post-production using the texture slider, but we can actually get much more sophisticated results using a technique called frequency separation, and this can only be done inside of Photoshop because it uses one of the tools called Gaussian blur as part of the algorithm. Another one of the things that is only possible in Photoshop is using another one of the very sophisticated blur tools called lens blur, and this is creating that tilt shift toy town effect that was very popular a few years ago, where we create a simulated lens blur at the top and the bottom of the image and just hold focus. It's an effect we can create with tilt shift lenses, but it's also possible to create in post-production, but not in Lightroom, only in Photoshop. Another thing that we might use, again it's another one of the sophisticated blur tools, is this time it's the surface blur. I actually picked up the reflections of a window because I was shooting through a window for this shot, and it's very difficult to remove those artifacts inside of Lightroom without seeing telltale tide marks in that sky. So again, I just selected the sky inside of Photoshop and then applied quite a strong surface blur to get rid of that distractions inside of Photoshop, and there is the completed image. One of the great things about Photoshop as well is, even if you're a novice, there are people who sell and share actions. I share Photoshop actions on my own website, and so with just a few clicks you could, for instance, change this image into this image, apply just a texture to that image and create that, and that action is actually available on my website. Again, just downloads Photoshop Actions, and then download that again. Again, if you find that useful, always consider that I might invest a day in making one of these actions and then sharing it. So if you do find that action useful in your own workflow, and this is one in an example of dozens of actions that I've got available for download for Photoshop. So if you do find that useful, I would appreciate your support. And there is an invitation to donate. You'll find a link in the info section below the movie on YouTube as well. If you're wanting to catch up with me, I think this will only, there were 2 places left on this particular workshop when I last checked, but occasionally if you follow me, you'll see that occasionally I am out and about in the world, and if you want to work with me on a one-to-one basis or in a small group, I do offer those options. So a couple of tours in the States in September. If you're watching this movie after September, I've been and gone. I've got another workshop going on in on the Great Barrier Reef in obviously Australia, the southernmost end of the Barrier Reef, a coral cay called Lady Elliot Island. A lot of wildlife on this island, very small island, but a lot of wildlife to shoot there, and so I've got that happening in November, and I'll have more workshops coming up in 2020 as well. So hopefully you've enjoyed that, and you've learnt 1 or 2 things. I know I've probably been rattling on now for a couple of hours, so you may have had to pause, gone off and had lunch and then come back. But if you found that useful, make sure you do head over to my website, www.markgaylor.com. I've got a lot of support for post-production and also for Sony Alpha owners. So if you're looking to get to grips, I've got lots of ebooks you can download. And again, Thank you for bearing with me. I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Alpha Imaging Ambassador.